Some of you might be like, Daniel, haven't you already done a video on the Hogwarts Legacy PC system requirements? Yes, it's right behind me right here, but back then we had minimum and recommended, and now they've changed and added more. A lot of people were very concerned, like I was in that video, that the minimum specs was a GTX 1070 or RX Vega 56. And it's like, I understand that a GTX 1070 is kind of old, but like, if you look at the Steam hardware survey, most people have a GPU weaker than a GTX 1070. So some good news. We have a tweet coming from the Hogwarts Legacy Twitter account, and they are saying, let me go back to this one. So basically, there's now listing 1440p and 4K ultra results, as well as frame rate targets, all of that. But also we have an updated minimum spec. It's different than the one that had been previously listed on Steam. The main difference now, let me kind of go to a bigger version of this that's easier to see, is that the minimum specs are now only a GTX 960. It does specify the 4GB version, because there was a 2GB version, so definitely careful on that, or a Radeon RX 470 4GB version. Okay, so first of all, that's a big improvement compared to where we were at with the GTX 1070 result. However, I have noticed part of this actually get more demanding compared to the previously listed minimums. In that video, I've screenshot it here, we had an 8GB memory requirement. So the RAM requirement was only 8GB, and now it's listed as 16GB. Now, one possibility here is that by only having 4GB GPUs listed here, it's more likely that some assets will need to, won't fit in the VRAM buffer and might need to go into the RAM buffer. So I wonder actually if you still had a GPU with, 8GB of VRAM or something like that, if maybe you could get by with a little bit less system RAM. But that's just me speculating, and the game has developed since 4 months or so ago whenever I did that video. So that is something to take into account here. Now, it's also saying you want a storage of 85GB. Now, it does list in a hard drive as the minimum, but it does specifically list a solid state drive is preferred. And honestly, guys, if you haven't got a solid state drive yet, I do recommend it as like the best upgrade you could do to your PC if you're stuck on a hard drive. Although I do know some people still use a big hard drive as like storing a lot of their game saves, and then they boot the operating system off of an SSD, all of that. Now here's the other big change though. These are still the minimums, but they're not targeting the same thing. Previously, the minimum had been targeting 1080p at 60 frames per second at low quality settings, but upscaled using a performance setting. Now usually performance settings are like a 50% on each axis resolution scale. I didn't specifically say that, but that's usually the standard term for performance, like if you're using DLSS or FSR. So that would be upscaling from 540p on a GTX 1070. Now, if we look at the newer version of these system requirements, it's now listing we're only targeting 30 frames per second. So we've cut the frame rate in half, which could explain dropping to a lower end GPU. And it's also now only targeting 720p, although it no longer lists upscaling. So basically, these were targeting a the older version was targeting, as far as I can tell, 540p rendering upscaled to 1080p. And now this is targeting 720p at 30 frames per second. So interesting. Now, upscaling does have some performance overhead, especially depending on the upscaling method used. So these could actually be similar requirements. They're just, I think, trying to show you that you can actually play the game on a lower end GPU. They probably heard people a little bit concerned over the GTX 1070 minimum, so they've made this more clear. But anyway, that is only at 720p 30 FPS low quality settings, so do not expect an excellent visual experience on this hardware. Now, the CPUs I might come back to a little bit more at the end because they do scale up as we go to the more demanding settings, but for at least a 30 FPS experience, they're recommending an Intel Core i5-6600 or Ryzen 5 1400. And if we hop over to like a relative, a database over here with some info on those, The Intel Core i5-6600 is a 4-core, 4-thread CPU from the Skylake generation, which came out in July of 2015. So if you just have a 4-core, 4-thread CPU from 2015, you can at least probably play the game. But again, that's only at 30 frames per second according to the system requirements. Maybe it'll do better. The Ryzen AMD CPU they're listing is a 4-core, 8-thread CPU. And this one came out a bit later in 2017, but at that time, the gaming single-thread performance of AMD CPUs did tend to lag a bit behind their Intel counterparts. So anyway, I think that's why we have the more recent AMD CPU versus the slightly older Intel there at the low end. Now again, getting back to the minimums real quick, let's talk about a bit about these GPUs. So I know a lot of problems people have looking up videos like this for the system requirements is, okay, I don't have a GTX 960 or an RX 470, so where does that put me? Okay, well, think of the GPU that you have, and I'll list this, this database in my video description if you want to go there yourself. But I think one of the best, I mean, it's pretty accurate, although, especially as the GPUs get older and things like that, and you're running them in newer engines, it doesn't always line up performance-wise perfectly with this, and different games favor different GPU architectures, but the point is, compared to a lot of relative performance websites on the internet, the one at Tech Power up here, I think tends to be both more accurate and very user-friendly in how to, well, you can click on any GPU, set it as your baseline, and it sets that as 100% performance, and now you can see how other GPUs compare. Now, the GTX 960 that they listed here was the 2GB version, and this game is specifically listing the 4GB version, so be careful about that, okay? This game is specifically listing 4GB, so you might have a 960 that's only this 2GB version. Now, I didn't see the 4GB version of the 960 on their list, but if we scroll down here, the overall 960 2GB is generally close to the performance of like a 1050 Ti. So if you're somewhere in this ballpark, it's similar, but again, that 4GB of VRAM could throw you some issues. The AMD GPU that they listed was a Radeon RX 470 at 4GB. So if I click on that one and set that as our baseline, I think this one might be a little more reasonable to go off of. So if you're comparing, that means that if you have a GTX 1650, that gets very similar performance overall. Or a Radeon RX 6400, that's a much newer GPU, but is actually listed as slightly slower than the RX 470, but pretty close. And again, depending on the game and the architecture, these percentages can be a bit off, but it gets you a rough ballpark, right? If you have an Intel Arc A380, that's kind of in this ballpark performance-wise. And so you could scroll up this list, see if you're falling, it's like if you're on a 1050 Ti, that's actually pretty far behind the 474GB, although it was closer to the GTX 960, but again, that's only the 2GB version listed here, so you gotta be careful about that. Now, if you scroll up and you start seeing more powerful GPUs, these are ones that should do better than 720p 30 FPS low. Maybe you turn up settings, maybe you turn up the resolution, and I should always mention maybe the system requirements are complete nonsense, but it's all we have to go off of right now. Are you guys interested in me benchmarking this game on any GPUs when it comes out? I'm just curious. Let's go ahead and look at what it would take to step up to 1080p 60 FPS, but also the high quality settings, which means, guys, there's a massive performance difference between this low spec minimums and these high spec, the high spec recommended, right? There's a huge difference here in the GPU requirements. So first of all, we're still at 16 gigabytes of RAM, same storage space, all of that. The CPUs have bumped up as well. So I'll quickly mention that. So the CPUs here are now the Ryzen 5 3600, which is a 6-core, 12-thread chip. This was a very popular bang for the buck gaming CPU for quite a while. I believe this one came out, in 2019. And then the Intel CPU listed up against that is the Core i7-8700, which is also 6-core, 12-thread. So they're definitely bumping up to 6-core, 12-thread CPUs. Now, the Intel one here is from 2018. So when we're jumping up to these 60 FPS CPUs, right? Because these are now saying that you can go up to 60 FPS. Also turn up the graphics settings. But running the game at 60 FPS more stably, it does look like they are recommending a much more powerful CPU. But if we get into the GPU differences, which is where a lot of people are going to be interested, we're jumping up to now a 1080 Ti or an RX 5700 XT, and they even list an Intel GPU here as the Intel Arc A770, so the highest end Intel CPU. It's not CPU, sorry, GPU currently available. So where does that stack up in our, what kind of a performance difference is there from like the RX 470 we were looking at jumping up into these GPUs? So from the RX 470 as a baseline, slide myself out of the way. We can now scroll up and you can find your GPU here, right? And what we're looking for is for like the 1080 Ti, RX 5700, was it the XT version? Wrong slide here. Yeah, 5700 XT version and the A770. So we scroll up here, you can see these get more and more powerful. More and more power. We're going past the popular GTX 1060. That is about 20% faster than the baseline according to this chart. RX 580 is about 23% more powerful than the minimum RX 470 GPU. Now we're getting GPUs like the 6500 XT, the GTX 980, the 1650 Super, all that kind of stuff. GTX 1660 is better than our minimum, but still we're below their recommended for the high settings 1080p 60 FPS. So we have to go all the way. We're even going past an RTX 3050. We're going past the GTX 1070 and 1070 Ti. Remember, this is about where the original, I should stop here maybe and say, this is where they had originally listed that 1080p 60 FPS low quality upscale performance thing as GPUs about in this ballpark, which is why I was concerned by how difficult that was. You saw how many popular GPUs are well below this. Now we're getting down right to the 1080, 2060. Arc A750, RX 6600, 2060s, 3060s, A770 is now popping up here. And then that's pretty close to our 1080 Ti, which can be more powerful, but I think in a lot of the newer games, it's a bit less optimized for it, and it does slip in performance compared to this relative performance chart. And then again, somewhere in here we have the 5700, the XT version should be in here. Somewhere. Did they not list it? They might not be listing it, but it's close in here. Let's go ahead and take this 1080 Ti kind of as the baseline, and we're doing like over 2 times the performance of the of what we saw as the minimum, and that makes sense. If we're at 242% of the performance, remember we need to go from 30 FPS to 60 FPS. Even at the same 720p low settings, that would require doubling the GPU performance. And then we're going from low settings up to high settings, so that would require more than doubling. So you can see there's a massive gap between these two specs. And I would say that that's where you could go up to, 1080p low settings, or then maybe you can get 1080p 60 FPS low settings, right? And then you can get up to the 1080p medium, 1080p high. So there's a lot of wiggle room between those settings, and hopefully that gave you an idea of which GPUs would kind of fall somewhere in that in-between sort of spectrum. But now let's get into what if you really want to push the resolution and settings. So they have given us this slide as well. So 1440p for higher end systems is still, I think, more popular than 4K, so we'll do that first. So here, first of all, notice we're also going up to the ultra quality graphics settings. So the graphics settings are being pushed higher, and we're going up to 1440p and still at 60 FPS. We're definitely talking using SSD here. And the GPUs they're listing here are a little bit confusing. We've got the 2080 Ti or the AMD Radeon RX 6800 XT. Now, generally, let me go to the relative performance chart to show you what I mean. If I set the 2080 Ti as the baseline, generally the 6800 XT is significantly faster. According to Tech Power up here, we're seeing like 35% faster. It can vary a lot game by game. So these seemed like odd choices to put next to each other in this chart. Other than generally NVIDIA has better ray tracing performance, But this game, I tried to search if there'd been any announcement of ray tracing settings, and I did not see any. So if there's ray tracing involved in this, I couldn't find it. It's just saying the ultra quality settings. It would seem like they would specify or have announced that the game had ray tracing if it had it, so I don't think that explains it. Now, I will say, I did confirm this is an Unreal Engine 4 game. I saw an article about it. So this is Unreal Engine 4, and generally NVIDIA does outperform AMD relatively a bit in Unreal Engine 4, so that could be part of it. And also, sometimes developers just have certain GPUs on hand for testing, and these, system requirements lists are really just kind of ballpark figures anyway. So I did want to touch on that, though. So that's pretty hefty requirements for 1440p 60 FPS Ultra. But I think even requiring a 6800 XT for those, we have seen these games that are targeting the newer generation consoles with kind of, the 6800 XT still doing well at 1440p 60 FPS ultra quality. But keep in mind that generally like an RTX 3080 is more of a relative performance to a 6800 XT. Now the CPUs here are also jumping up to an i7-10700K or a Ryzen 7 5800X. Now, usually turning up the graphics settings does not have a big impact on CPU. It can have a little impact on CPU, but this is definitely stepping up the CPU requirement. And again, that would be consistent with ray tracing, because ray tracing does usually put a significant load on the CPU as well as the GPU. Anyway, but again, like I said, I couldn't find any confirmation of this involving ray tracing, so maybe not. So Intel Core i7-10700K, 8-core 16-thread CPU, and fairly recent. This one came out in April of 2020. And the AMD CPU here is the Ryzen 7 5800X, which is 8-core 16-thread, and came out also in, this was a 2020 chip, right? Yeah, this was November of 2020. So fairly recent, although the newest generations from AMD and Intel do offer better gaming performance than these do. Now, another thing I'll mention with these going up to 8-core 16-thread is, okay, first of all, this could just be nonsense. You might not need this, but I will say, I did find confirmation on the Steam page that this game does have de novo anti-cheat, okay? Anti-tampering, sorry. And de novo, I think in some games, has had a significant CPU overhead. So I'm hoping that's not going to be causing us issues in this game. It does have de novo listed on the Steam page. So there's that. Anyway, back to the GPUs. So 1440p 60 FPS Ultra. Like I said, I don't think this is ray tracing, but they're just listing those as kind of an odd pairing. So anyway, the 2080 Ti, if you want to look at it compared to like our 1080 Ti, that has 78% of the performance. So this performance jump here does seem to make sense to me, just going from 1080p high to 1440p ultra. This does seem like a reasonable step up. We've got our 6800 XT here as well. And then lastly, let's end with what if you want to step up to 4K 60 FPS at ultra settings, what is that going to take you? They're listing a 3090 Ti or Radeon's new RX 7900 XT. Now notice it's the XT, not the XTX. And again, this is for 4K 60 FPS ultra quality settings. The CPUs have now stayed the same. But the other thing I probably should have mentioned on the 1440p results is now going up to the ultra settings and the higher resolutions, they're listing 32 gigabytes of RAM, right? We went up to 32 gigabytes of RAM, and it's keeping that for the ultra 4K setting. So yeah, we're up to 32 gigabytes of RAM on the higher resolutions and ultra settings. And a lot of people built gaming PCs kind of scrimping on that 16 gigabyte. Now that doesn't mean it won't work on 16, but it is listing 32 here now. So interesting to take a look at there. All right, we've got the 3090 Ti or the 7900 XT. So where does your GPU fall in comparison to those? Well, probably significantly worse if you're the average person. So 2080 Ti up to the 6800 XT was that 35% bump. If we now set the 6800 XT as the baseline, the 3090 Ti, if we're not talking ray tracing, is about 26% faster than the 6800 XT. And then if we jump up to the 7900 XT, that's right there in that same ballpark. So for non-ray tracing performance, the 3090 Ti and the 7900 XT are generally at 4K, fairly competitive performance-wise. So this seems to line up with reality. Anyway, what do you guys think? Are you interested in this game? What do you think about the system requirements? At the high end there, it's definitely getting pretty high end. At the low end, it looks like you can play it. But like a lot of people were thinking, this game's coming out on the Nintendo Switch. How could this possibly be this demanding if it's coming out, or take 16 gigabytes of RAM and it's coming out on the Switch? I will say that, let's talk release date and console real quick. So this game has been delayed a lot, but it's now coming out February 10th, 2023, and I believe you can get it 3 days early on some of the more expensive deluxe version of the game or something like that. You can get some early access to it. Now, that's also a consistent release date for the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series consoles. However, the older consoles, the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, have been delayed till April 4th. So what this is telling me is it actually isn't up and running on those older systems very well, and they need more time to try to get it working right. And the Nintendo Switch version has been delayed all the way until July 25th, 2023. So what that tells me is I don't think even like the equivalent of the PC, 720p 30 FPS low is not equivalent to what they're going to be having to run on older consoles. I think they're going to have to tweak those down even further. And that explains some of that discrepancy, because people were I know in my last video, people were like, this thing's supposed to run on a Switch and it requires a GTX 1070, So it looks like it's probably not running very well on the Switch right now, which is why it's getting delayed significantly. Are you guys interested in me actually benchmarking this game at all when it comes out on various GPUs? Let me know, and I hope all of you have an excellent day. Oh, and if you have a laptop, laptop GPUs and CPUs depend a lot on their thermal stuff, and this video is long enough anyway, but just be aware that the laptop versions of these, if you're comparing, generally aren't as powerful as their desktop counterparts, and you'd need to do more research on that. Now I hope all of you have an excellent day.